Hello and welcome to Rewildology, the show all about conservation, travel, and rewilding the planet. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell-Norman, conservation biologist and adventure traveler. If you're anything like me, then your definition of a fun summer day includes some sort of body of water. Maybe you live by a wide, flowing river and go boating on the weekends. Possibly one of your friends has an epic pool that you soak in every chance you get. Maybe you're a beach bum and don't care if you're at a lake or by the sea as long as sand is involved. Yes, we humans love water, and so does every other living creature on this planet. It is becoming clear that we're approaching a water crisis between water security issues, climate change, and extreme weather events. While we're being heavily affected by these changes, wildlife is being affected even more. Every time we alter a water source for our own use, the wildlife that depends on that source is faced with direct and indirect challenges for finding enough water to survive. One scientist is working diligently to bring this issue, along with possible solutions, to the table. His name is Charles van Rees, PhD, the guest of today's show. Charles grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, and was a pretty disconnected kid in school, which I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. He didn't discover his passion for nature until he became heavily involved in a seemingly unrelated practice, martial arts. By learning the way of the warrior, Charles realized that his skills had no meaning unless it benefited others, and he knew after taking an environmental science course that he wanted to dedicate his life to conservation. Charles and I chat in depth about the current water crisis and its effect on wildlife. We also talk about a huge paper he's currently working on that might change the way we view and handle freshwater ecosystems. In his free-ish time, Charles is also a regular host on the Nature Guys podcast, a super fun show all about getting outdoors and exploring our backyards, which I highly recommend you all check out after listening to this show. We recorded today's episode in my living room in Denver, Colorado, as Charles was road tripping from Montana to Georgia to start his new and exciting career. We had so much fun recording this conversation for you all, and I hope you enjoy it just as much as we did. If you're liking the show, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to never miss a future episode. Also, if you'd like to support the show, check out the new Rewildology store at rewildology.com. At least 10% of proceeds from this podcast will be donated to our conservation partners. All right, everyone, on to my conversation with Charles. But before we dive into who you are really deep, how are you liking Denver?
I am enjoying Denver very much. I mean, it's just a big change of pace for me. Mm-hmm. Now that I've been living in rural Montana for almost 2 years, being around young people is a shock. Yeah, it's very different. Seeing lots of people is different. Having coffee shops and things to go to. And this is weird. This is what always surprises people. But honestly, at least where I am in Montana, it's not easy to find places to get outside and recreate. And I know that sounds really weird.
That is really weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge state, right? It's I think it's the fourth largest state in the country. And it is mostly outside. And yet access to outside things is really difficult in certain parts of Montana, especially in lower income areas. And I've been living in a much more low income part of the state, really. And so most of the beautiful outside land is all owned by billionaires, and they're not going to let you on. There's fences everywhere. So, if I ever wanted to, that was something that really shocked me, because the first time I lived in Montana, I lived in a much more wealthy area, and that brings all the kind of Denver qualities of like all these, this is of course one of the advantages of those areas getting gentrified. And of course, there are way more problems than there are advantages. But one of the advantages of a place like Bozeman, where I first lived, is that those people who come in value access to nature a lot. And they have views that should be more of a right, or that should be more of something that everyone gets to do. So in Bozeman, there were literal like trail systems that were designed to come right off the street and get you to the top of a mountain. And you could literally like walk out of your coffee shop and just go to the top of a mountain and come back, and where I lived, that was not the case. And I had to, I usually had to drive, over an hour to find a place to go for a walk. And then of course, if I'm driving over an hour, I'm thinking to myself, well, I can't just take a stroll. I need to go and get out there.
It's worth it.
Exactly. So I'm going to walk at least a couple hours anyhow, and so that was difficult, I think, especially being kind of an early career interdisciplinary academic, the amount of workload I've been juggling, I didn't often have that much time to do this kind of stuff. And so it really hammered my opportunities to go outside, Whereas, here there's just so much. There's so many trails near the city. Took a 15-minute wonderful little walk through some drainage swales near this apartment complex. It was beautiful.
May have even found an endangered bird, right?
I may have found, exactly. And I don't know what their status is in Colorado, but I'm pretty sure I saw a Say's phoebe, which is actually one of my favorite flycatchers. Believe it or not. I absolutely adore them. Yeah, they have this cute, plaintive little song. It's adorable. This one wasn't talking very much, probably because we're too late for the breeding season. But yeah, you just find all this great nature, and it's harder when everything's fenced off. You can't do those kind of rambles as much. And that was, Anyway, so that's why I like Denver so much. That's one of the big things I really enjoyed is all the cool city aspects, but clearly, the prevailing culture here is one that values that access. And public lands are super important.
Yeah.
In general. So anyway, that's my long
because we the hike we went on, because you spent a lot of time in Estes Park, which is awesome, up in the Rocky Mountain National Park, which is beautiful. But the hike that we went on this weekend was just right outside of Golden. And Golden is pretty much the city over from here.
Yeah.
And so we were 30 minutes away and we got, at least 4 or 5 mile hike in?
It was a serious hike.
Yeah, it's definitely one.
And, those were all probably somewhat disturbed chaparral ecosystems, but it was a testament to how much great biodiversity you can encounter in a place that has had a lot of human impact. I mean, there was a lot going on there. There were a lot of native species. We saw really cool insects. The plant life was amazing. Bird life was pretty nuts. I mean,
you got a lifer.
Life bird. That does not happen to me. That's in North America, that's really hard for me unless I'm I haven't been to the Southwest yet. And that's my big plan is that's going to be a bonanza for me. But yeah, I mean, that was awesome. And that was half an hour. And I where I lived in Montana, which is interesting.
That is super interesting. And I just had no idea. I've just never really been to that part of the United States yet. I just haven't had an opportunity to get there. Cause
yeah, for sure.
When I've been to Yellowstone, it was the other side is Wyoming. Cause that's an relatively easy drive from here.
Yeah.
And I was just in the national parks camping the whole time. So there's so many aspects of this stuff that you don't see until you actually are in a place for a long time, which I'm all about. Actually experiencing a place versus just popping in and popping out. But sometimes it's hard. And that's why it's really interesting to hear people's stories about that kind of stuff. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I had no idea that. I mean, it's freaking Montana.
I know.
And I have a very different, I have this view of Montana as this big, beautiful, glaciers there, all this outdoor stuff.
Yes.
And just to even think that even someplace like that, it could be hard to get out in nature.
Yeah, it's
pretty mind blowing.
Yeah, you just have to find, I think, different ways of doing it. But it is, I think it's a lot more. It was a lot more difficult, at least where I was. Yeah, but I love Denver. I mean, this is always my problem. Is people always ask me, "Oh, what did you think of this place? What do you think of that place?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, there was this diversity of flowers." And they're like, I was asking about the bars, dude." And I'm like, "I can't help you. I don't remember the name of any bar."
Beer scene.
Yeah, and I love a good beer here and there, but I don't. None of that stuff sticks with me. But for me. I remember writing about this when I was living in Europe a lot. A huge part of my sense of place comes from the nature that I encounter. And that's how I remember a place is I can walk down a path. I'm like, oh, this is where I saw the longhorn beetle, emerging from tree bark or what have you, And I think that's one of the beautiful things about having, being a naturalist. I don't mean that in any sort of hoity-toity, really uppity way. I just mean that anybody who wants to study nature, it gives you an incredibly powerful sense of place because you're learning so many other, because human minds and human memory, as far as I understand it, works a lot more like a network. And the more things you have connected to things, the easier it is to remember them. And so we're already pretty good at remembering places. But when you start attaching experiences and other meaningful things, like when you become a naturalist, seeing a certain bug starts having meaning to you. It's not just oh, there goes a bug. You're there goes a who's what. And I think all these things about it. Or I remember that last time I saw that, I was with my friend Brooke, and that made me happy. And now I feel good when I see that bug. You can really add this incredible depth to your life, I think, by becoming a naturalist. And so I'm always very evangelical about it and like trying to get everyone to like be a naturalist. But that's something I notice is that there's a whole nother dimension to every place I go now. I get to experience the bars, meet the people, whatever. And then I'm also like, wow, I had never seen that butterfly before. That was cool. Or oh man, the swifts here make a different sound than the ones where I grew up, and like what, things like that. So it's
that was you on our entire hike. It was like, they have a different accent. And it's so funny because
crazy.
I'm definitely more on mammalogy side. So, like mammals are more my thing. So I like to be on an awesome hike with like a birder that knows birds really well. Like to talk about birds and accents. I just lost it. I was
Isn't that wild?
This is the funniest thing.
Yeah.
But it's just, I just don't know any better. I mean, I definitely enjoy all these birds and like the ones that I'm more attracted to, of course, the predators. So I was like, hawk, eagle, oh my God.
Right.
And that's more of what I'm doing. So to hear your experience out of it was really interesting as well. It's like, wow, that's a different accent than where I grew up. I'm just like, that is awesome.
Yeah. And
it's just like such a human way to say it.
Yes.
It's like,
yeah. And I think
great.
those parallels, especially dealing with like vertebrate animals, so many, to use like nerdy biological terms, like so much is conserved across the vertebrates, which is to say that we have so many things that are exactly the same because over evolutionary history, there was no reason to change them.
Right.
And so we just have all these things that we completely share, like sneezing and yawning and stuff. Like so many vertebrates do that. And it's kind of weird that we're exactly the same in that sense. And like accents for vocal animals, that's one of those things that you can go to Missouri and go to Massachusetts and like listen to an Eastern Phoebe and they sound totally different. And like, why not just say the Missouri one has a Southern drawl? Like it's the same thing. It's the same thing.
That's amazing.
So yeah, and we encountered that, and it totally freaked me out. It was cool.
You're like, I'm so confused. No, it was fantastic. You're like, no, that's definitely the same bird. It just has an accent.
Yeah.
Like I've just never heard it.
Yeah,
like,
that was messing with me for sure. Yeah.
Oh my God, it was awesome.
It was a lovely hike.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So we're talking about the differences between here and home. So let's go back in time. Let's explore child Charles.
We're talking time machine back.
Time machine back. Because you're not from Montana.
Right.
You're definitely not from this part of the U.S.
Yeah.
So let's go back. What was your childhood like? Where did you grow up? And when did you decide to get into conservation?
This is it's a really, because you always look back on these things and you're sort of constantly assessing that narrative. And I feel for a while, I felt kind of embarrassed by my path going into it because it was not particularly traditional. I'm so used to talking to all these like really talented biologists and they're just like, oh man, when I was 5 years old, I collected 700 plant species and pressed them. And then like, whatever, like this botanist thought I was great. And then, or like, oh, my dad was an ecologist. And then I got all this extra training. And I think that's amazing. And it's so cool. And I really admire people who have just been in it forever, but so I should say, so in terms of the where I grew up in the Boston metro area in Massachusetts, Eastern Mass. So very different. And we're turning our time machine. I'm dating myself here, but we're going back to like early 90s when I was like a functional human being. I was born at the end of the 80s, but I missed all that. Except for the good music, I guess. You can't lose that. And so I think, my path into conservation was a pretty indirect one, really, certainly in a professional sense. I was always the weird kid. I still am the weird kid, but I think it's much easier to be the weird kid as an adult than it is as a child. It's, all the few friends I had were also really weird kids. And that's fine. But, I wasn't, through elementary and beyond, I wasn't very athletic. I was always kind of like very sickly and very shy and just very strange. I had way too much imagination and it just like my imagination dominated everything in my life. I was like anxious about things or I was just always thinking about other stuff. I was diagnosed with ADHD at a very young age, and so like school was hard in a sense in that like I was just too busy thinking about other things or making up stories to myself and things like that to really do well. So I wasn't phenomenal at math. I wasn't particularly good at science or anything like that. In fact, originally my main push was I wanted to be a fiction writer for a long time. That was like a huge thing for me. But I guess in terms of the seeds for conservation, I think came from my being a weird kid, not having a lot of friends. And so then I would just spend a lot of time alone, kind of dealing with my own imagination. And that usually in a place like the suburbs of Boston, where there is a lot of forest. It's really interesting. Eastern Massachusetts is one of the most afforested areas in the United States, which means that as opposed to deforested, all this formerly agricultural land has been abandoned for 100 and whatever years. And so all these forests are coming back in Eastern Massachusetts. And so there were always woods nearby where I lived. And I would just go and walk around and probably, just pretend to be a Power Ranger or whatever. But in the process, I'd run into some insects and be like, whoa, what's going on there? Or see some bird or what have you. And that always gave me some interest. And then I also loved nature shows. And that's typical. That's, and I was really, especially because it was the 90s, Marty Stauffer's Wild America was my jam. And I can just remember being like a very small child and like whenever it was on, I would like sit there with a bowl of like ramen noodles and like watch Marty Stauffer, and it would just like change my life. So that was huge. But I don't know. I just sort of I don't think I knew what it meant to be a conservationist, to be a scientist. I just sort of like thought it was cool and like wasn't really applying myself. And what really, and this is interesting for me, when I really look back on it, this has been a strange realization that what actually did it, what actually got me serious and into conservation and on that path had nothing to do with wildlife and nothing to do with, the environment or ecology. It was martial arts. And, people always look at me sideways when I say that. But yeah, I was kind of having this, I don't know, very, very like aimless, dreamy childhood for a long time. And then when I was around 14, 15, 16 age, I started getting really interested in martial arts. I don't particularly know why. Probably some school bullying and stuff, but beyond that, I don't know. I was really drawn to it. I was drawn to the philosophies of East Asian martial arts. I was drawn to the aesthetics of the movements and the techniques and things. And the two martial arts that I started getting really interested in and reading about and then training in were Aikido, which is it's an interesting kind of 20th century fusion of a bunch of very old Japanese warrior traditions, and which was one of the first kind of mixed martial arts in the modern sense that was invented by Bruce Lee, who of course has a lot of name recognition. Yes.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. Absolutely. And he, I think, obviously he had an absolutely huge impact on the martial arts community and his philosophies and so on. And I was a gigantic fan of his and his martial art. But anyway, to kind of cut to the chase, yeah, I would say, two major principles coming from the founders of those two martial arts really affected me a lot. And we can get into that because that's sort of oddly been this guiding thing in my science and in my career going forward. But I think what really did it for me in terms of doing martial arts was, one, suddenly I was applying myself and being good at something. And that was I hadn't really done that before. I'd always been kind of like the smart, weird kid who could be funny, but I was never like good at anything. And suddenly I felt like I could excel at things and learn things and be accomplished. I would get tested and examined in martial arts, and I would like make the grade and like get these promotions or whatever, or I'd like have a sparring session and like feel like I was in control. And I was like, wow, like I've never done that. I've never felt that. And also, when I started to get into the culture of martial arts and the philosophy, there's so much about personal discipline and taking control of your life and your thoughts and what you do and learning to concentrate and things. I think for someone with my learning disability, that was a very powerful thing to learn. That it wasn't like, oh yeah, like whatever, go take some medication or what have you. And of course that stuff can help a lot of people in a lot of ways. But it was especially powerful, I think, for me at that time as like a young teenage boy to learn like, wait a minute, I could just do this myself. Like I can just develop my willpower and concentrate. And so suddenly I started like really trying hard in school, all these things like that. And it was all coming from inside. I just wanted to do it. And that was really powerful. And I still wanted to be a fiction writer, but I was just trying hard in all these topics because like, okay, I guess I have to go to college. I guess I have to do all these things. And I was really fortunate to participate in like a summer program at Brown University in environmental leadership. And that really struck me. That was the first time I started to get really aware that like, yeah, okay, I thought bugs were cool. I thought birds were cool. I like being in the woods. But I really started to connect all that to like, wait a minute, we're like losing this stuff all the time. We have all these dramatic environmental problems. Our society is creating these problems. And how are we going to deal with it? We need to do something. And that hadn't really hit home with me. And I think because I had started practicing martial arts, especially learning from the really traditional principles and philosophies of Budo, which is the Japanese way of the warrior. It's this kind of like set of like tenets around like, if you are a martial artist, if you are a warrior, you should be these things. And, as an impressionable, like 15-year-old boy, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I need to be. A big part of the Japanese martial arts tradition is like, yeah, okay, you've become strong, you've become dangerous or whatever. That all of that is meaningless unless you are serving the world, unless you are protecting or doing something useful. Your strength has no meaning unless it benefits others. And that was a really powerful thing for me at that age. And so between starting to get into that and doing this environmental thing and learning about all these issues, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to have a mission. That's the whole point of being a warrior. I need to do something. And so I started, oh my gosh, I need to become a conservationist. I need to do something to benefit wildlife. And then the interest in science, I think, started to go a lot more. My father is an engineer, so he was always telling me about science things, bringing me to science museums. And so I had a lot of exposure to it. But this brought my like, passing like, oh yeah, like science is neat, into like, oh wow, science is what I have to do. Because at that time, certainly I was, very myopic and was kind of like the only way to save all the species is to become a scientist. And so I picked out this undergrad program at Connecticut College because they had a specific certificate program devoted to conservation issues and conservation biology and environmental science. And I was like, that's what I have to do, because it comes with like a paid internship. You get all this extra training. I was like, I need to go there and do that thing. And that was like a bit of a risk because you had to like apply for it and like get in, and it was competitive and whatever. But I was like suddenly so motivated, and I went and did that, and I like got in, and I had this like amazing undergrad experience. Yeah, like just learning about what conservation was and finally getting some science background and getting really excited. So that's how I kind of got into it. Is this weird mix, I think, of like some coincidental events and very oddly, East Asian martial arts were kind of what started it. And I think all of that has kind of spiraled and expanded in lots of ways since then. But to avoid rambling endlessly on this question, I think that's that's how the real, the initial contact was made with conservation as a field.
That is so cool and so unique. The fact that you were able to connect these two seemingly different things, these different life experiences, something that you were completely entrenched in, as well as just an observation in the world as you were finally exposed to it, and then connecting those two disciplines together. That's just so cool. Like when you look back, it's like, wow. And you still study martial arts now. Like you have black belts and brown belts and blue belts and it's like you're fluent in like how many different martial arts? I mean, fluent in the sense of like languages.
Yeah, I think, you can compare it to languages. Absolutely. You have ones with common roots and ones that are totally unrelated to other ones. And I mean, again, of course, these two things are always interacting with each other, right? Like my conservation career has affected my martial arts so much and vice versa. And I think because I've been an academic now and been interested in conservation, I've had to travel all the time. I haven't lived in the same place for more than like a year and a half in a long time. And that has meant that I've had to move around a lot. And one of the interesting advantages of that is, as a martial artist anyway, I'm always exposed to new approaches, new disciplines, new people. And so I've been learning such a diversity of techniques. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I have definitely lost count of how many schools I've studied at. And I've lost count of how many like certificates I have from various martial arts programs and whatnot. But yeah, I think I would consider myself today someone who practices 4 different martial arts like pretty consistently. And then I've probably, had certifications in like 15 or 16 or something. And it's like, and that's less of like, oh, wow, so impressive, and more like a dang, this guy moves a lot kind of thing, But
yeah, because we just celebrated this past weekend. You just got your blue belt in jiu-jitsu. Like, holy freaking crap.
That was a big one for me, I think. I love your language analogy. And I think for me, going to Brazilian jiu-jitsu from my background in, by now, I think my background is much more strong in karate, Muay Thai, boxing, a lot of what martial artists will call a striking art to one that's on the ground. It's a grappling art.
Yeah.
And so this was really like switching from like Romance languages. This would be like if someone was like pretty good, like almost fluent in like Italian, Spanish, and French. And you're like, all right, cool. Let's learn Mongolian. That's kind of how it was for me. And so, like a blue belt is a beginning step. And, I really consider myself finally starting to train for real. But yeah, I'm still out there learning Mongolian. And so that's been, very satisfying.
Awesome. So we're obviously not even near close to done with academic career. So we've made it through undergrad and
yeah, I'm old, by the way. So
no, you're not. Jesus. So, but let's continue on. So, okay, you have this fantastic undergrad experience, and the seeds were really planted. Like, this is my life. Like,
this is what I want to do for sure.
So, what did you do next? So, I mean, I know that you stayed in academia, but why? And what did you end up studying?
So I guess to answer the first question, which is what did I do next after undergrad? The one word answer to that is I struggled. I finished my undergrad right after the huge economic crash. I was so intense about getting a million different experiences in my undergrad that I what do you call that? I like overbooked or whatever. I took way more classes than you were supposed to all the time. And then I focused all my effort on getting straight A's every semester, no matter what. And then I was like the president of a martial arts club and I was like doing all this other stuff. And so I just like, I was so, and again, this is probably that like martial arts discipline thing, but I was like so over disciplined that I didn't pay attention to like what other things I needed to be doing to move forward with my career in conservation. I was too busy thinking about like, let me get these short-term goals done to have the larger view of like, well, what do I need to do to be competitive for those jobs or what have you? And then of course, because of the economy crashed, there weren't none of those jobs. And so I eventually somehow someone was like, oh, well, you need to go to grad school to be a biologist. And I was like, oh, really? Oh, okay. What's that? And I hadn't been spending the time like getting research experience. I'd just been taking 5 extra classes and doing all this crazy stuff because I thought that's what you needed to do. I thought you just needed to like be smart and work hard. It turns out like you need to know people and like, get advice and get mentoring. And I just didn't really have a lot of that. And also, adding to this weird snafu, the really good like conservation and ecology professor at my school that was doing the kind of stuff that I was into, he was away in Japan for like a year and a half of the time when I should have been getting mentored by him. And so that was just a bad luck kind of thing. But essentially I finished my undergrad, had not gotten into any graduate programs, had been rejected from quite a few for having no like real research experience, or at least not knowing how to sell what I did have very well. I didn't know what they wanted to hear, even if I had a lot of research experience. And then there were no jobs anywhere. And so I really struggled. And that was really hard. I finished, in like the top of my class. And so we, I got all these like awards and stuff for being like such a great scholar and what have you, and all these like titles. And I was like, wow, like that means I get a job, right? And the economy was like, no, are you kidding? And so, yeah, I struggled mostly. And I spent a lot of time applying to and getting rejected from tons of field jobs. And like, luckily that professor, his name is Bob Askins. He's a fantastic ornithologist and just a really cool guy. He came back and like kind of found me in this like struggly position right before I graduated. And he was like, what on earth? Like, all right, let me sit you down and like, we'll figure this out. So he helped me get a short-term summer job doing some field research on birds. And I took an ornithology class with him my last semester. And that's actually how the bird stuff started. Like up until then, I was way more like, I guess, insect oriented in terms of my natural history. But he was like, okay, this is how you have to get into graduate school. These are the types of jobs you should be doing. And you need to just like take a couple years to just do field work and get that experience. And, that was a pretty weirdly disillusioning and devastating time, I think. And I think anybody in our generation is pretty familiar with that feeling. I think a lot of us spend our childhoods in the 90s getting like, and early 2000s, getting built up and getting told like, yeah, you're going to work hard, you're going to go to college and everything's going to be great, And then a lot of us were like, oh, hey, the economy crashed. Where are all the jobs? Why are the wages so low? I think we've all encountered that. And that was, for me, that was when I really hit hard because there weren't a lot of jobs in conservation. Everything was retracting. There was all this, what do they call that? Oh, this is a good word for that. I can't remember that, but like that sort of economic drawing in of everything. And so all these opportunities, just dried up. So I worked in Connecticut for the National Audubon Society, and hung out with these two graduate students that were doing this project, and they were my bosses. And I just like absolutely super looked up to these people, and they taught me so much. One of them is Kevin Burgio, who's a absolutely fantastic parrot researcher and macroecologist, and also just like a cool dude. Like he's like a punk rock style guy, and he's like, you know, and he's got all these tattoos, and then you talk to him and he just can like, he'll just go on about like Bayesian statistics, and you're like, well, what a person, what a human being. So him and Chris Field, who's a absolutely brilliant scientist as well, also amazing kind of stats wonk. And they were teaching me like, oh, hey, well, this is what you have to do to get into grad school, and these are the things you should know. And I was learning also like, well, how do you act when you're a scientist, and what kind of things do you talk about, you know? And it was a good experience in that sense. And I went from there to having no job, and I like worked at a Trader Joe's for like, I don't know, 6-7 months, just being like, what is happening? And then eventually got super lucky, got another like cool research technician job that was really oriented towards learning. It was kind of like a miniature master's degree. Like they'd have you work to like earn your keep, and then at the same time you'd be conducting your own independent research and getting advised on it by PhD students and postdocs and, you know, and researchers and stuff. And that was really cool. And it was one of those things where it was this internship program where they had like 4 openings, and like, I don't know how many hundreds of people would apply. And like somehow I got like super lucky and got a position there. And, you know, you get paid absolute peanuts, but you're like, we were living on a research station in the middle of nowhere in Florida in this super unique desert ecosystem, which you don't picture when you think of Florida, but it's like these scrub deserts. They have all these endemic species, you know, just very different. And I just got to stew in that and like hang out with other academics and again, like learn about research or whatever. That was huge. That really made a big difference. And then from there, I went to California, and I worked at another research station on some projects that were kind of joint Cornell University and UC Berkeley. And so I was, I guess, employed by both of those somehow, and doing research on woodpeckers. At the other place, I should say, I was doing research on these endangered cooperatively breeding jays that live out there that are just super neat birds. And so the bird thing was really happening. And I kind of got, you know, everyone's always like, oh yeah, Charles is a bird guy. I'm like, well, I mean, we can get into what kind of guy I am, but the bird thing happened because like I was getting jobs doing birds, and like I wasn't getting jobs doing dragonflies or whatever, but I was applying for them, you know, but birds kept happening, and that kind of stacked up. And obviously, you know, no shade on like the bird world, like ornithology is amazing, and I love all the people I've met through it. But so it was just sort of this hopping around for 2.5 years, and I worked in California for a while near Monterey. It was just beautiful. And then I came back to Massachusetts because I got into grad school that spring in the exact place I wanted to go to grad school, which was Tufts University. And then I worked at a totally non-academic job, and I went and I was like conservation research, I don't know, seasonal biologist or something for this really cool NGO on the North Shore of Massachusetts called the Trustees of Reservations. And I did a bunch of shorebird conservation and restoration work, which was fantastic. Yeah, I guess one major thing that I should mention is like while I was in Florida, I went to my first scientific conference because of this whole miniature masters thing that was so nice. And it just lined up with this conference in Jacksonville, Florida, which is a place to witness. And I mean, that was really like the only other thing going on at that huge hotel other than this ornithology conference was a gigantic biker convention of this biker gang called the Buffalo Soldiers, which is like this really cool, like all black, like biker organization. I don't think you probably want to call them gangs anymore, but you know, and they all had their like colors on and stuff. And I ended up actually spending more of my time talking to those guys than the professors and stuff, because I was so intimidated by the ornithologists. And I remember like all those guys would have the chapter that they're from on their vest. And I like walked by this group of dudes and all their vests were like Buffalo Soldiers, Boston, Mass. And I was like, whoa, what's up, Boston? And I went over and just started talking to these guys, and like they were so much more like outgoing and easy to talk to than like the academics. But in the process of me being at my first academic conference and being terrified of everyone, I remember seeing a guy's name tag, and it said J. Michael Reed in like really messy handwriting. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've been reading this guy's papers for like 2 years. He was this like scientist that like my whole thing was like, I loved behavioral ecology. That's what I figured out in college. And I was like, how do I apply animal behavior to conservation? There's got to be a cool way to do that. This was my kind of like very slow academic maturation. And he wrote a really amazing chapter in a textbook about like how to do that. And he wrote like a really good review paper on it. And like, he had all this stuff like, yeah, like in fact, it's not just that, you know, behavioral ecology is relevant to conservation. if you do conservation without understanding behavior, it's not going to work. And like, because classical conservation biology, I know this is a huge tangent, but classical conservation biology started with just numbers and like numerical models to represent species and their populations. And like, obviously that's important because you need to get results and you need to influence policy. But he was saying like, yeah, but you have to work the behavior in there. You have to understand what these animals are doing. Otherwise your predictions are going to be way off. And I just thought that was amazing. So I see this guy's name tag and I'm like legitimately having a heart attack. And I just like, oh, so bad. And I like woodenly like stumble over to my like boss from this place I was working in Florida, because he was like, we were like little ducklings following him around being like, oh God, I mean, the other interns were way more bold and relaxed than I was. I was just totally overwhelmed. And I walked over to him and I was just like, can you introduce me to Michael Reed? And he was like, who? And he looked over, he's like, oh, Michael, that guy's great. Yeah, of course. And he, and just like typical like old white guys with huge beards, they kind of like march up to each other. Oh, Michael, good to see you. Like it was just this whole thing. And they were both like so happy. And he's like, yeah, this is my intern, Charles. Like he really wants to meet you. And I was like, oh God. And I could not believe it. Like this is, especially now having been in academia a lot more, like I cannot begin to explain how rare and ridiculous this is, to march up to like a tenured professor who has a lot of stuff going on, who like has published a ton, who like is not a small name. And I was just like, I love your work. I was just absolutely word vomiting. Like I don't know if anything I said made any sense, but I was just like, oh, you're so cool and your research and I read this paper and blah, blah, blah. And he was just kind of looking at me and he was like, hey, do you want to just go sit down? Let's just talk. And I was like, what? And literally like he sat down with me at this conference and we chatted for almost 2 hours.
Wow.
And it was mind blowing, and the biggest thing we talked about, and this is a major theme in my approach to conservation, and I think that came from my martial arts stuff a lot, was just, I kept saying, I see all this research people are doing and I don't get how it benefits conservation. Like everyone's researching endangered species, which is great, but like people aren't organizing their questions around solving problems. And I find that so confusing. And people keep like telling me that I'm not doing good science because everything I'm interested in has to do with like, how do we inform this policy, or how do we solve this issue? How do we really address those problems? And he was like, well, yeah, that's the kind of research I do. We call that applied research. And like some people really hate it, but that's what I love to do. And I was like, oh, applied research, like I have a word for it now, And we just had this whole rant about that. And I just found it so exciting to know that like you could do a career in academic applied conservation research. And I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I have to go to grad school with this guy. This has to happen, and I kept in touch with him. I got really lucky. I learned how to apply to grad school and finally did a good job at it. And I ended up getting into Tufts University, where I did my PhD for 5.5 years, which was a whole... Yeah.
Is he the guy that you showed me the picture of?
Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
my God.
Yeah. That's him. He's the best. He's like honestly one of the best human beings I've ever met. Like that guy like changed my life.
Ecology Santa Claus.
He's He's got this big beard. And,
Santa Claus. Yeah. He's amazing looking.
Yeah. I think he's more like a wizard now. Like his hair, he like grew his hair out during the pandemic.
Oh my God.
I saw him for the first time, since the pandemic recently when I was at home visiting my family, because it had been a long time since I've seen my family. Yeah. And I got to go bird watching with him, and he's just got like super long, like beautiful flowing hair now. It's wonderful. He's a majestic human being. Michael Reed is great. So that was how my PhD went. And people say, and I will say, if anyone listening to this is interested in applying for graduate school, especially a PhD, which is a very long haul, the big thing to focus on is, what vibes do you get from your potential advisor? Like that person is going to be so important. And yes, a lot of people who are more on like the kind of elite academic side will say like, no, just see how many papers they publish. And like, you just want that name. But if you just want that name, then, it can be hard because you're not going to have anyone to support you. And I was lucky to find someone like him who, he does a lot of amazing work, but he also just really just cares about his students a lot. And so it was like having another dad. And I was still so clueless when I started graduate school, that to have him to kind of like hold my hand through a lot of this stuff was amazing. And I had this incredible, very fun, very exhausting, totally tumultuous 5.5 years of doing my PhD and like traveling all over the world and doing research in Hawaii of all places. And that was just amazing. I loved it. It was such a good time, but that was how that next chapter happened.
Wow. And then what did you end up studying like for your PhD, and how did you decide? Because it sounds like, which this is super fun, which I really want to dive in with you in a little bit, is you have so many different interests And which I feel is a strength,
Yes.
which you have come to learn in academia has actually gone against you.
Sure, absolutely.
I view as from an actual world standpoint as a huge leg up. And I'm really excited to see where your very close future is going to go, because I see it as a big, this is awesome. You don't just like study one bacterium and that's all you know. Like
Right.
you have a very wide breadth of disciplines that you're very knowledgeable in. So, but before we get to those, what did you end up studying? And then how the heck did you even decide to study this? Sounds like you could have done anything.
I mean, sometimes these decisions get made for you a little bit. You know, I definitely I was learning a lot, you know, but I don't think because I see a lot of people starting their PhDs and they're like, I'm going to do exactly this and exactly that. And they just knock it out and it's amazing. And I was not there. I was not there at all. I was still very much trying to, you know, I knew I wanted to do behavior stuff. I didn't have what's called a study system. I didn't have a species or an ecosystem I was going to focus on. But two major things happened. One of them was there was this brand new fellowship program starting at Tufts that came from a big NSF grant called an IGERT. An interdisciplinary graduate education research traineeship. Wow, got it. And basically, those are these really, now there's called something else, but basically it's when like an institution gets a huge bunch of money and they are allowed to like competitively choose graduate students to give them specific training in how to work across academic disciplines to do stuff. So obviously, like, you know, if I think again about my martial arts background, like, this was the Bruce Lee side, right? Like the Japanese Budo side was like, you need to do something, you need to help people, you need to protect things. And that was what got me into conservation. But then in terms of like how I wanted to do conservation, Bruce Lee was the big influence because he was all about, and this is what Jeet Kune Do was, right? He was like, you need to take whatever works from whatever discipline. He was all about like, because up until like Bruce Lee, really, there were arguably there were some people actually in the 1800s who did this a bit, but he was the big one. He was like, everyone's so siloed. There's the karate guys and they talk crap about the wrestlers, and the wrestlers talk crap about the Muay Thai guys and whatever. And he was like, we need to do away with this and just take whatever works and combine it and be interdisciplinary. And so from him, I learned like, yeah, you need to have this. If you're going to be practical, if you're going to be applied, then you need to do whatever's going to get the job done. You need to not sit there and be arrogant and not want to learn new things. You have to constantly be humble, constantly expose yourself to something new. And I had been doing that in martial arts already. All through college, you know, I spent all my time, I was like an Aikido Jeet Kune Do guy, and suddenly I'd go hang out with wrestlers and get my butt kicked and then like, you know, teach them some stuff and whatever. And so getting into this interdisciplinary graduate program was incredible because I got to do the same thing. Obviously a lot less butt kicking involved, but but like I got to do the same thing with academics.
Guys involved with this, like, hopefully not.
Yeah. And so I just, you know, I was suddenly, it was called water diplomacy, and it was about how to sustainably solve. And this is not just environmental sustainability. This is societal and economic sustainability, you know, hydrological sustainability. But basically I got brought into this program and I was the token ecologist. Like it was all these like international relations people, engineers, hydrologists, civil engineer people, agriculture specialists, political scientists. There was like a guy with a law background, and they were like, yeah, we need an environmental person. Do you want to just be part of this? And I was like, what? Yeah. And so I was the token ecologist. I was the guy where like, you know, all these like way more intelligent, amazing, super talented grad students who like already had masters and stuff. They were all like, oh, blah, 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 this water resources issue. And like, have you read Ostrom's something principles? And I'm like, and I would just kind of raise my hand every now and then like, birds. And then people would be like, oh yeah, birds. And like, and that was kind of how it went. So that made my graduate experience really unusual because I was doing my PhD in biology. I think the actual degree is ecology, behavior, and evolution. And so I had to do all that stuff and like take those courses and do my qualifying exams and blah, blah. But then in addition to all that work, I was basically doing like a master's in like sustainable water management, where I had to take a separate set of qualifying exams. I had to do all this other coursework, go to all these seminars and workshops with those people. But I was simultaneously like becoming a biologist and learning to be a super, super applied person who knew all sorts of crazy stuff about water that I would never have been exposed to as just a biologist. And so without knowing it, I was starting to do Jeet Kune Do in my academic work. And that made my graduate career very difficult because I had to do almost twice as much work as the normal PhD. But, I was publishing papers both on the biology of this endangered bird in Hawaii that I was studying and on how do we do a better job of including the environment in our decision making around water? And so I was getting these two prongs to my work, and I was learning to slowly at the end when I finished my PhD dissertation, which is a horrifically long document. At the end, I was starting to tie those back together again and applying those ideas from sustainable water management to Hawaii, which is a place that has some water issues and that is going to have quite a few more as time moves on. So, and then the Hawaii thing happened for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons was that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had a lot of very particular questions about a couple endangered birds there, and they really wanted answers. And my PhD advisor was one of the people who was a big expert in one of those species. And they were like, hey, we don't know anything about this other one. It's called the alaiula, or Hawaiian common gallinule. Very mysterious, weird, hilarious birds. Actually, a lot of very important cultural relevance for them too. They play a big role in a lot of Hawaiian mythology. Really neat animal. But they were very mysterious, and we needed to figure out a lot more about their behavior to conserve them better, which is totally my jam. So I got started working on that bird because the Fish and Wildlife Service came to him and was like, hey, we have a little extra money. We need to get someone out here, and we need to start studying the movement of these birds. And then I got brought in for that, and just had this whole adventure of, 4 years spending every summer in Hawaii chasing these weird birds around and just getting hot and sweaty and just having a very interesting time, and then going to Alaska to do genetics work on them and crazy stuff like that. So yeah, that's in as much of a nutshell as I can get you to for the absolutely monumental experience of doing a PhD.
Great. And I'm so glad that you really just started to bring up your very big interest in water. And this is something that I know, because you and I've talked about this so much. This is really where you have planted your flag, because you see a big issue and it's going to become an astronomical issue if things don't change. So, but before we get into that, what is this water crisis that's going on? What exactly are you seeing? Because I think that this is one of those issues that has been boiling, for lack of better terms, behind the scenes. Yeah. That no one's actually really talking about. And it's going to start being a really big thing. And I think that this year and this summer, so we're currently recording this, it is August, 2nd or 3rd, something like that, 2021. And we just had one of the hottest summers on record. Right. And there is crazy droughts going on. There's fires rampaging across the U.S. right now. So we're starting to see this firsthand. So what have you learned? What exactly is this water crisis? And what have you discovered? What have you studied? And what are you starting to advocate for now?
Very, very well phrased question. That is, oh my gosh. Okay. I'll have to think my way a few steps back here, but yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. That's a really good way of, I think I learned more from your question now than I have from my own thinking on this in quite a while. So well said. But I think, so the water crisis, globally speaking, I think is a lot of different crises that a lot of people now treat as though they're different, but they're not, in my opinion. And that's a big thing I think that I'm starting to put forward as an academic and as a conservation scientist, as I advance in my career and gain a little bit more of the ability to say, hey, here's my opinion, maybe someone should listen. That's one of the opinions I'm trying to put forward, is these aren't separate, but I'll give you the separate crises if that works. So let's see. We have a water security crisis, and water security is one of those lingos I learned from hanging out with all the political science and international diplomacy people in the IGRT program. And it refers to, it's usually at the population or state, some jurisdictional level. It essentially refers to how safe the water supply is in a number of different senses for a group of people. So that could be a city, that could be a state, that could be a country. And so that could be, do they have a reliable water supply? Do they have clean water to drink or to bathe or do all these things that we need to do as living organisms, but especially as people? Is that under threat? And different threats could be, well, could someone upstream cut off your water, basically, with a dam and say, no, it's ours now? Or could they take so much out to irrigate their crops that you don't have any water left? I mean, we're doing that to Mexico right now. Could that be ecological collapse that leads to algal blooms, that then these algae produce cyanotoxins or other chemicals that then kill people when they drink the water, or is it pollution from some company, right? Like Flint, Michigan. What have we done about that lately, right? But that's a real thing, and that's happening all over the world. And, Flint gets covered because it's in our country, or some might argue it doesn't get covered. And I think that's also a reasonable critique. But those are water security issues, and that's a crisis. We know that there's probably some numerical index of water security out there. I don't know it because I'm not a sociologist, but we know that water security as a whole, quantitatively or qualitatively, is declining worldwide. Everyone's access to clean water and the water that they need to live a good life is going away. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. But of course, the major one, which you're already referencing very well, is climate change. A lot of hydrologists, for example, and maybe because if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but hydrologists have always been saying climate change is water change. And the more that I really look at it, the more I'm like, yeah, you guys are right. Like the temperatures, yes, that's going to affect stuff. But like the shift in the distribution of where, when, and how water happens on this planet is going to change so profoundly, and is already changing so profoundly, that all of these systems that we have as human societies have been developing for thousands of years to manage our water, a lot of those are becoming obsolete or irrelevant to what the water is now doing in the natural environment, which means that a lot of people aren't going to have water security. I don't have the exact statistics fresh in my head anymore, but I think some of the projections for as early as like 2050 were saying that like more than half the planet, I mean, we're talking billions of people, are going to be at one point in the annual cycle are going to be in a state of what they call critical water security, where like they literally don't have enough water to live. And you don't need to have not enough water to live for more than a week to die, right? So it doesn't matter if they're not critical all year. If you're critical for a month, that could be a lot of people in a lot of danger. So that's the water security crisis. Another one that is, of course, a big part of my work as a conservation biologist and as a naturalist is the freshwater biodiversity crisis, which a lot of really amazing research has been coming out about this recently. But if you want to think just as a conservation professional, which I know a lot of our listeners are really into that, some people will think, okay, well, we should look at what the most threatened parts are. And all of those are fresh water. The WWF did a fantastic study. I think they finished it in 2016 or 2017, where they used huge amounts of data from all over the place on, I think, primarily vertebrate populations of animals, but like a bajillion different species planet-wide, to look at how fast populations of different species are declining all over the planet. Everybody's declining. Let's be clear. Like, no biodiversity is not somewhat in trouble. We're all here fighting the good fights, and I'm not trying to draw lines. They divided biodiversity into freshwater, marine, and terrestrial. And they have this super depressing graph that shows all of those lines going way down because everybody's hurting right now. But the decline in freshwater biodiversity, I want to say, was more than double the rate of what we're seeing in and if you think about terrestrial systems, like the Amazon is getting cut down, like Indonesia is like burning, the pampas are going away, and like all these amazing ecosystems are getting encroached by agriculture or deforestation or pollution or whatever. So like obviously terrestrial systems are really in trouble. And to think that freshwater systems are like that much more dramatically messed up, it might even be 3 times, like that's scary. Like that's where the real damage is being done. That's scary enough. To get even scarier, if you start looking at freshwater biodiversity, it also makes up way more of the species on the planet than we expect. If you look at just the number of like animal species in the world, something like, I'm trying to remember now, it's huge. It's like 10 or 20% of them are freshwater species. Not even like ones that use freshwater, because all animals need to use freshwater in some capacity. Obviously, marine things have all sorts of systems for dealing with salts and whatnot, so they're not as directly relevant. But like everything terrestrial, at least, cannot survive without water in some way. But just thinking about the things that live inside of freshwater, the actual surface of freshwater on the planet makes up, I'm trying to remember how is it, like 1% of Earth's surface or less is freshwater, and yet 10 to 20% of all the species on the planet are like directly living in freshwater as their habitat. Oh my God. Right? So it's hyper concentrated, hyper valuable biodiversity, and it's getting annihilated out there. And so one of the things that that I've written about already with some really brilliant co-authors, and I'm working on some more stuff kind of raising attention about this, is like, we need to realize that, the water security crisis and the freshwater biodiversity crisis are not separate. Those are very much related for a number of reasons, right? Whenever we manage water more to increase our water security, a lot of the time we are hurting biodiversity even worse. And it doesn't have to be a trade-off. And that's a big part of what my research with the IGRT was trying to help policymakers and decision makers find ways of getting ecology, getting species, getting animals and wildlife to the table, getting them to the bargaining table, and including them in our sort of, for lack of a better word, calculus of figuring out how to manage our water. Because there are amazing win-win situations that you can simultaneously address both of those crises. Everybody wins.
What are some of those?
Well, the big thing that's come out recently, and there's a lot of push for it and not a lot of doing, which is very frustrating. But, and again, WWF has talked about this. The Nature Conservancy talks about this a lot. And there are so many different terms and euphemisms for it. One of my favorites is nature-based solutions. So that's, a lot of that focuses around climate change, but that's finding solutions to climate change, finding solutions to water security or food insecurity that use the benefits that nature brings us. Right. So we as scientists are probably much more familiar with the term ecosystem services. What do wild ecosystems and habitats do for us as people? And we know that there are lots of different kinds of ecosystem services and all sorts of insanely valuable ways that just having natural environments on this planet help us. Most directly, like if we wiped out all the natural environments on this planet, like we would probably have problems having enough air to breathe, and there would be no food. And that stuff is blatant, perhaps overlooked because it's so obvious, but there's all sorts of other stuff. Like if we're thinking about water and those two crises, wetlands and aquatic habitats, they clean your water for you. They also make your water supply more reliable. When you have a massive flood, which is happening increasingly in a lot of places, if you have wetlands and intact floodplain forests, bogs and things like that, then the water overbanks. It goes into those ecosystems. It causes a massive proliferation of biomass and biodiversity and just incredible natural stuff happening. And then at the same time, that water gets slowed down a lot. It gets physically obstructed and slowed down. It also gets absorbed into the environment, into the soils, into the plants. Some of it gets evapotranspired back into the atmosphere to rain again somewhere else. It goes into your aquifers, which are like long-term storage tanks for water. So you reduce your flood damages with those habitats, and you gain a much more sustainable water supply. Your water security goes up. You have more chances to have more water in the future, rather than just, boom, here's a flood, it killed 1 million people, and now all of our buildings are destroyed and we can't drink that water because, like people say, stay the heck away from flood water. Like when a flood happens in an urban area, that's sewage, that's, dead cats, that's, it's trash. Like it just takes everything, and you're not going to drink that. No. That's not good for anybody. All that is destruction. But if you have a flood that goes through a wetland, that's getting metabolized by an enormous diversity of microfauna, of microbes, fungi, bacteria, archaea, protozoa. All these things are metabolizing it, and it's also getting physically purified by the plants, the roots, the sediment. You get incredibly clean water that is sustainably provided, basically. And we didn't know this for a long time. We spent years developing all the wetlands and paving them over for parking lots because mosquitoes came out of them sometimes, and we didn't like that, or we thought they were smelly. And we were like, this is useless. And we channelized our rivers to make them super straight so that the water would just go away. But all that happened was it made the flooding worse for somebody else. Or it took all the dirt out and put it right out to sea, and that screwed up our fisheries, or it made the deltas disappear. And deltas are super important habitats for all sorts of animals that we love, not to mention all these fish that we eat and birds that we like to watch. So it's incredibly interconnected and interdigitated, all these different processes. And what we're learning now is like, well, wait a minute, like we could be simultaneously benefiting biodiversity, saving ourselves, protecting human rights and people's access to water, and hugely increasing the bottom line. We could be saving ourselves so much money. And there's a lot of really neat examples of this. There's actually one really literally close to home for me where the Charles River, which I am partially named after, which goes through Boston, there was some amazing work where it flooded a few times and people were really worried about it. and the Army Corps of Engineers like re-meandered parts of it. Like they made it back into like a squiggly natural looking river, and they bought people's properties around it that were in the floodplain and were like, can we just buy this from you and take your land and like let this become, you guys go buy a house someplace else, whatever. They would restore the floodplains, and suddenly now like the water quality in the Charles went way up. It's way more clean. The ecosystems are amazing. Flooding isn't affecting people anymore. And like that investment has saved so much money and probably some lives, and things like that can be done elsewhere in the world where they'll have even bigger impacts. So the nature-based solutions train, I think I definitely have drank the Kool-Aid on that, and I'm like crazy about it. And I think it's a major way of simultaneously recognizing the interrelationship between the water security crisis and the ecological freshwater crisis, but also addressing them both at the same time, and probably for much cheaper than we might do otherwise.
So let's explore two facets of this then. Who is going to be affected by this the most if we do not stop what we're doing? Mm-hmm. If the brakes on the train are gone and we are flying 100 miles an hour and this doesn't change, what is going to happen? Who is going to feel it the most? And then in all of your work that you've done so far, all of these papers that you've published, all this just knowledge that you have, how do we stop the train? How do we work on pretty much reversing what we've done and restoring these habitats? How does this actually get done? So what is like worst case scenario? And then like, how do we flip it around and bring things back to the way they were? Right.
These are excellently practical questions here. And I'm not going to say that I have all the answers to these, and I can certainly get to what I think would work well. And I can also let you know the places where I'm like, oh, someone else has got to figure that out. But in terms of who's being affected, I think you bring up a lot of really important social equity issues here. And I think, if you look at issues in Flint or issues with Hurricane Katrina, overtopping built infrastructure where there used to be wetlands to protect people and they're gone, and then tons of people are killed and lose their homes and have nothing. Or, you look at the catastrophic and frequent flooding in places like Bangladesh, which is, as a landscape, that's a lot of wetland and a lot of floodplain. These water-related threats like flooding and drought and water quality issues, which are very tied in with both, that are coming from climate change, that we are seeing getting more dramatic all the time, they are affecting lower income and people of color way more often than other demographics. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. And I'm not a sociologist and I'm not going to pretend to know them all. But I know that in a lot of countries, a lot of these vulnerable flood-prone areas are more poorly regulated for land use. So lower income people who have nowhere else to go a lot of the time are ending up in those areas. It also gives them access to certain ecosystem services like fishing or finding the deer that come there or what have you, or even just needing to be near water when you have no sustainable supply. Those people are either being drawn to those places or forced into those places. And then they're extremely vulnerable, right? And then, of course, the other major thing is like when you have money, you can adapt. If something bad happens to you, you can go build a new house, or you have the ability to pay. If you're in California, right, and there are horrible droughts, you can maybe buy into a desalination plant, or you can excavate a much deeper well to get water that no one else is allowed to access or has the ability to access. Wealthier people can get away from this, and they can keep kind of pushing, like kicking the can down the road. They can keep escaping it. But lower income people who are in these vulnerable social positions, or who have been, a lot of times actively marginalized by the rest of society, they're the ones who are really going to be affected by this. And they're the ones I think that we need to focus on when we're thinking about conducting these nature-based solutions, changing the way we manage infrastructure and making changes to find these win-wins. We need to concentrate on the projects that are going to protect those people, because they're the ones that are going to be affected. Thinking just about biodiversity, and I think this ties in really well to a lot of the amazing descriptions and speaking you've done on the field of conservation travel, but poorer, lower income people are more closely tied to the biodiversity in their area. They're more directly dependent on those ecosystem services. They can't replace that with technology. They don't have the resources for it. And like you said, a lot of those people are also relying on sometimes economies that are directly related to those ecosystems, whether those are extractive like fisheries or less extractive, like ecological tourism, wildlife tourism, things like that, conservation, travel. So when we focus on these win-win situations, I think there's a lot more room to really, really benefit these people who are more threatened, because you could be restoring ecosystems, bringing back species that would give them either better fisheries, better food supply, or better sustainable job supply. By, people are more likely to go, want to take a river cruise and see monkeys and stuff if like the habitat around the river has been restored to natural floodplains that bring tigers in or what have you. I think there's a lot more benefit for those people, and that social equity issue is, it's not lost on me, but it's also something that I'm not a huge expert in, and I'm really interested in learning from people who know more about that. How we can make this, as our governments start to become more aware of the fact that, well, A, we need to do something, and B, restoring ecosystems and taking advantage of nature-based solutions is a way we should be doing it. I'm interested in learning about, how do we make sure people aren't getting left behind in that those benefits are going towards the people who are really going to need them. And we're not just, restoring wetlands around rich suburbs all the time, right? So.
Right. Yeah, no, that was fantastic. It's just like a win-win, like you said. It's like no one's really going to lose here, especially in a long-term thing as climate change gets more extreme. There's like all the buffers that we've destroyed. If we just put them back in.
Buffers is a great word. Yeah.
Then, all these massive storms that are coming through and just washing everything out, they'll have somewhere to go, and then it'd be way easier to distribute the water. It's just like there's so many things that as this gets more on the world stage, the political stage, and also too, like having traveled so much, this is a big international issue, and it's getting a lot scarier and a lot bigger because there's people that, they had water security issues before.
Yes, right.
And it's just getting, with population numbers skyrocketing, there's too many people in areas, and like a desert, desertification is happening at alarming rates. And when that happens, then people have to move, or people getting pushed into these areas that are now deserts that should have been grasslands or, whatever. So then that's why I'm really glad that we're talking about this and just having more ways to bring this issue up.
For sure.
And it's all connected. And the more we restore things to their former beautiful habitats, then the more everybody's going to benefit. And not just because it's pretty, I hear birds.
Yeah.
I get some peepers at night, it's little froggies. It's actually, this is way bigger than that. Yeah. This is way, way bigger than that.
Absolutely. Very well said. Yeah.
So I think next, it'd be really cool. I don't know how much you can talk about it, but with all this being said, and the way that you talk about this issue and how much you care about it and how much you know about it from this very multi-pronged view of the world that you have with all your studies, you have this big paper you're working on that you're hoping that's really going to shake the world. Yeah,
well, I'm not sure I'm going to take my own ambitions that far, but I think it is. Yeah, so we're talking about a paper that I'm working on now that I'm hoping to be submitting soon that focuses on what I'm calling human environment water conflict. And it's not some, massive new theory or whatever. I think it's the kind of thing that my brain is good at as like the weird little kid on the playground, with ADHD who would rather watch antlions than go play kickball or whatever. But I think that, while I'm not the best scientist in some ways, you see really amazing scientists who come up with these incredible quantitative theories with differential equations and whatnot. Like I'm more of like a big picture thinker, and I'm more just focused on the pragmatics a lot. And what I'm trying to put forward are some, what I would call syntheses, where I'm just trying to say, hey, whoa, let's really big picture here for a second and look at how related these issues are. And I think I really liked how you put it, where you were saying like, yeah, we need to understand how these are all interrelated. I think that what I'm trying to do in this paper is explain how, these are all interrelated, and that's really scary and overwhelming. But when all these things are interrelated, that means that if you fix one, you can fix the other too. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize. So I don't want this to be like a doom and gloom thing, but what I'm writing about is this concept that I'm calling human environment water conflict, which I guess I would describe as understanding how whenever we are managing water, we are affecting wildlife, and not just the fish in the stream, not just the marsh plants, but all sorts of things beyond that. We're affecting terrestrial biodiversity. We're affecting marine biodiversity. So bringing together fields like what's a really neat field called ecohydrology, which is the study of how water affects ecosystems. Bringing that together with our study of how we manage water as a society and how we need to do it more sustainably. Bringing that also together with things like what I did as a graduate student, which was developing frameworks for how to bring animals to the table, bring wildlife and ecosystems to the table, include them in that process. I'm basically trying to advocate for, hey, this human environment water conflict is a thing. We are causing huge ecological problems that we don't yet recognize by how we're managing water. Some of them we recognize, of course, but a lot we don't. Giving a lot of examples of ones we don't necessarily see readily, and then talking about, hey, we need to bring people together from all these different fields to make some greater synthesis and move this forward. And what I'm really trying to say is we don't need some huge new field to develop. We don't need new sciences or theories for this. We need to take what we already have. We have the tools, but we need to get them in the same darn place. And we need to get those people together to have this kind of discussion. And so that's sort of the big idea behind it, and so some of these really neat examples I've been thinking about, we usually just think about, okay, we took the water out of the stream, the fish died, it's too bad. Or, oh, we built a big dam, the fish can't get all the way up the river to spawn, their populations crashed, too bad. Or we took all the water out and for agriculture, and then the trees in the riparian area along the margins of that stream their roots couldn't get down to the water, they died. Okay, too bad. Those are all very blatant, direct examples. We took the water, we moved the water, it's gone, stuff died. Okay. And that's great. And there's a lot of research on how to address that. There's really I think e-flows, environmental flows is the main kind of lingo for that science now. And there's some amazing people in Europe, in the United States, in Australia especially, who have been developing this theory around e-flows. And what I'm proposing is to extend that idea beyond the river channel to recognize how when you mess with fresh water, you mess with everything. So e-flows is about, if we have a dam or if we're drawing water from a river, let's always make sure that there's enough there to keep those ecosystems intact. And let's figure out what that fish needs. Maybe it only needs water at certain times of year. So if we use the water this time of year, store some up in the dam and then release it at the right time, we can do enough for that fish to spawn, or for that riparian bird to have its little ground nest on the sandbar or something. And that's amazing science. And I love that. And it's so applied and so perfect. But I'm, thinking bigger picture. I'm like, well, gosh, when we mess with water, we're not just messing with those shorebirds or with those fish. We're affecting the dynamics of the insects that emerge from the water. We're affecting the groundwater systems that are connected to those rivers and whether or not there's floodplain habitat. A good example is, looking at other ways people are using water. When I was living in Spain, I did a postdoc in Spain right after finishing my PhD. I was working at this beautiful, incredible wild landscape called Doñana. And a lot of it is protected national park. It was actually the first place that the WWF ever protected.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was their first big achievement. It was literally the year that they founded. They were this was their big thing they were doing, was Doñana. And we can talk about that another time. It's an incredible place. But it's all these protected areas with all of these it's Mediterranean, so it's very dry. And so all of these wetland ecosystems inside Doñana are groundwater fed. The water's coming burbling up from under the ground, coming from these aquifers, and they're wet for certain times of year. And all these endangered frogs and super rare birds will nest in them and stuff. And then the water's gone and whatever. And there's a certain amount of time that those pools have to be wet for all that to happen. And what's happening now is that people, a lot of them, there are lots of illegal stuff going on, but even if you ignore that, perfectly legally, lots of people outside the borders of the national park are pumping groundwater up to irrigate strawberries. And a lot of the strawberries we get in the US are from Spain, and they're delicious. But it's what is that movie? There Will Be Blood, I think, where they're arguing over oil, and basically if all that stuff's underground and your property line is it basically overlaps with the whole aquifer. If someone puts their straw in on one side, on the legal side, outside the protected area, starts sucking all the water out, what happens to the stuff inside, right? It's still gone. And so what's happening now is that people using all the water outside is actually leading to less water inside the park. And now all these species are really endangered, but they're not doing anything illegal, are they? But we didn't pay attention to the water that wasn't in the river channel. So in my mind, that's the exact same problem. It's just all happening underground, right? Mm-hmm. Or what if we think about water in the sky? Okay, we're getting a little trippy here, but just bear with me. We have learned, for example, through ecohydrology, and now we need to connect it to these other frameworks. We need to connect this to how we manage water. We've learned that if you cut down trees, let's say in a valley in the Amazon basin, the next valley over is going to get less rain now, because those trees aren't pumping water into the sky through their roots, through evapotranspiration. So literally, if you have like a national park in one spot, and then you know, because you need to support the local economy, what have you, political reasons, this other neighboring valley like has to get deforested because, you know, we've conserved one part and we have to compromise, right? That park is deforested. Suddenly, the moisture that's supposed to be in the air of that cloud forest and supposed to drift over and take care of the ecosystem in that national park that has evolved over millions of years to be supported on that sky water, right? Those clouds, it's all gone. So then you start to get all this damage in the national park, the bromeliads and all of these plants that live inside of trees and their only source of water is from the sky. They all dry up. Some of them need to fill with water, and there are species of salamander and frog that are like their whole ecology and natural history depends on cloud water and nothing else. They never touch the ground their whole lives. They spawn inside of these bromeliads. They'll make babies inside of them, or they'll go in them when things get too dry as a place to hide. All that water's gone. Where do they go? And we've seen species of salamander that are endemic, you know, to these treetops going extinct in national parks. They're in areas that are totally protected and they're not getting affected by fungi or what have you. But the big thing is just the clouds are gone. We took the water from the river in the sky and didn't think about it because we're too busy thinking about the rivers on the ground. And the rivers on the ground are super important. Okay, and the last weirdest example. So we've talked about rivers in the ground, rivers in the sky. There are also rivers in animals. Okay, and I know this is the trippiest one, but right, there's rivers of animals, like rivers that are animals that move across landscapes. If you think about the African savanna, and you know a lot more about this than I do, so pipe in if I start wandering off here. But elephants and wildebeest and a lot of other very large mammals that are super charismatic, super cool, and super ecologically important, right? They change the whole darn landscape when they're around. You know, elephants will tear down trees and stuff. Their migrations, the timing of those migrations, and how they cover space, like their space use and how they choose their route, is all based around water. You know, with elephants, I think they have these matriarchal social systems. And apparently there's a huge emphasis for those females, like the ones that become matriarchs that are effective, that can protect their families. The way they do that is by remembering where all the water is. And when we start, again, maybe draining water from the ground, if we're sucking it up with pumping to put it someplace we want it for crops, or if we are, a lot of people, I think in a lot of parts of, I want to say sub-Saharan Africa, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, are heavily dependent on livestock for their livelihoods. They need to get their cows watered, right? And with climate change, those watering holes are starting to disappear. And what's happening is that people, because they need to live, are monopolizing those watering holes. Their cows are congregating around those watering holes such that wildlife can't access them a lot of time during the day or in the morning. And so that's not only changing the migratory routes of these super important species, again, that river of animals back and forth, it's also making it so that when they do need to get water, they have to do it at night, which, as far as I understand it and what I've read, is a much more dangerous time to be a wildebeest drinking water. You can't see the crocodile that might be coming out of the water.
You can't see that line.
You can't see that line, exactly. And they've shown that like mortality rates go up. And also the amount of time they have to spend looking around goes up. So they waste more of their energy being scared than eating or drinking. And so this is one of those weird, really indirect conflicts that we are creating because we need the water too. And if we can find ways to maybe find those win-wins, we can be protecting people, protecting those ranchers who need to, you know, who are literally dependent on those farm animals, but also protecting the lions, the gazelle, you know, all these wildlife populations that are inherently dependent on that water. And then the final step into weirdness. So we have these rivers of animals. There's also these flows of animals that are like very literal in terms of food. There's like a nutritional flow of animals. So a lot of wetland habitats are very dense with aquatic insects, especially, but various aquatic arthropods, you know, things with shells. or carapaces and kind of segmented joints, little buggy things that they need to live in fresh water to exist. And what's really interesting is that they are a different food chain than stuff that lives on land. So the base of the food chain for terrestrial systems that we're familiar with, Colorado, that's, you got some grass, you got some plants, caterpillars eat it, grasshoppers eat it, and then other things eat them, and then on you go up the food chain. What starts with grass and what starts with terrestrial plants has a certain nutritional value because plants are capable of creating certain nutritional elements, sugars, carbohydrates, blah, blah, that we're using. What's fascinating about these things in freshwater environments is that the base of the food chain is often not plants in the sense that we think of. They're not flowers and grasses. They're algae and diatoms and these weird microbes that they're not plants. They do very different stuff on a cellular level, which means that the nutrition that they create is actually a lot of times way more valuable than the plants. To get specific, they're producing these polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, which is way more fun to say, that are, we've learned that these are insanely important for vertebrate development, for like your brain and your nerves. Like if you don't get these in your diet, it's hard to develop those things. And there's actually anthropologists who think that a big part of how humans became super brainy is that we ate tons of foods from these water environments that had high PUFA concentrations, which gave us enough fats to make giant brains. Things like, it's crazy. But what happens is then when we start messing with the water, we change the community of insects, for example, that's able to live in that water, or we decrease their numbers. The abundance of insects coming out of these that are basically, flowing out of these water habitats, be they rivers or floodplains or marshes or, watering holes in Africa, that food supply crashes. And suddenly all these animals don't have access to that food chain. They can't get those very specific molecules that they need to develop their brains. And there's been some really brilliant research on birds, especially, showing that if they don't get enough of that food, their babies don't survive as well. They don't, fewer of them survive to fledging. The ones that do fledge don't live as long or don't reproduce as well, even the following year. There's these impacts on the populations. A study came out in the last couple of years showing that in North America, we have lost something like 3 billion birds since 1950 or 1970, I think the last 50 years. We're having these catastrophic bird declines pretty much across the board. And there is no single smoking gun. We don't know what's caused all those declines. But when I think about it, I'm like, well, shoot, most bird species in North America, especially at that key time of raising their babies, even if they eat whatever the heck the rest of their lives, when they're raising their babies, they're feeding them insects or insect larvae. And we know now that, of course, there's that effect. If they're not getting those PUFAs, they're not doing as hot. So what if us messing with water this whole time, changing the flows in the rivers, developing the wetlands, stuff drying up due to climate change, or us pumping all the water out, what if that's part of the reason we lost 3 billion birds in this country? What if we change the diets that they're able to have and they just can't reproduce as well? We don't know. That sounds as weird to me as probably a lot of Rachel Carson's stuff sounded, when she first put it forward, but she was right. And I don't think it's ever one smoking gun. I think this might be a major thing to think about. So that's the final and weirdest of the flows I'm talking about. But this paper is about, water is so dynamic. We need to pay attention to all the ways it moves and all the things it affects and all the ways that we affect it and how that's affecting biodiversity. So that was a very long rant. Obviously, I've been thinking about this for a while, but, but thank you for giving me a platform to soapbox real hard about that.
Yes. And so everything you said can be a little overwhelming, for lack of a better term.
My gosh.
If somebody listening to this is maybe they've never heard of the water crisis or they're just not quite aware of like, what's this going on? And then we're like, oh my God, Charles, you just like freaking punched me. I have 2 black eyes now.
Oh,
like, let's distill this down a little bit.
Sure.
So what can I do? What can anybody listening to this do? What is because I'm a very, like you said, I'm an actionable person. Mm-hmm. What are the little things or big things or just habits or whatever behaviors that we as society, people can do that can at least start getting the conversation going or putting the right foot forward to start to really help this issue? What can I do? What can Brooke do sitting right here right now?
I always think politics first. I'm always like, just pay attention to what people are doing in your area. Pay attention to the elections that you never do. Pay attention to city council. Pay attention to, I don't know, really local government level stuff, or even just like whatever acts are being passed and things. I know it's hard to keep track of all that stuff, but like we need to vote and we need to be informed citizens, because there are a lot of people out there who are running for election and things like that, who are aware of some of these connections or who are open to the ideas. And we need to have those people able to make decisions right now. It's really problematic to have people in offices where they are completely turning a blind eye to what's happening. Usually because those marginalized people who are being affected are not voting for them or whatever, so they don't care, right? But I think that's a big one, is paying attention to that kind of thing. I think one of the best ways also is advocating for wetlands. I'm a huge like wetland nerd, and they're not the only part of the whole equation here, but spend time near natural water places. Learn to appreciate them for what they are and how special they are, how important they are for biodiversity. Invite other people to go hang out near a swamp with you. As weird as it sounds, Sure, put on bug spray or cover up or whatever. I mean, mosquitoes aren't usually that bad in really intact environments a lot of the time. But teach other people that wetlands aren't gross, that they're cool, that they're important. Do a social media post about how awesome the ecosystem services are of your local river, and help people appreciate things like that. There's always, most human civilization comes up around a surface water source of some kind. So find your local wetland, give it some love, tell other people about it, help people appreciate it, bring some bird watchers there, or other naturalists, get to know it a little bit. I think that kind of stuff can go a really long way in changing people's minds, because I still talk to people all the time. Like, oh, what do you do? Well, I don't know. I guess part of what I do is study wetlands. And they're always like, oh, I'm sorry, that must smell. And I'm like, no, it's awesome. It's the best. Like, they're so cool. And people don't realize those connections. So yeah, help people understand the relevance, right, between biodiversity and water, how all that's connected. And certainly, I think the work that people are doing around social justice issues that connects to this so intensely, like that's really important. And I'm probably not the one to give them advice on what to do about it, but support those efforts too if you see them, because social equity issues are a huge part of this that is inextricable.
Yeah. Go love your nature.
Yeah. Go love your nature. Find a local wetland. I actually just started a Twitter hashtag recently that I'll probably expand elsewhere with a bunch of other similarly minded people. But we have hashtag wetland fan club. And like, please post some pictures of your local wetland with hashtag fan club. You can also tag me if you want so I can see it. But we need to increase the love of freshwater habitats so that people know that they're great for us, that they're great for nature, and they're just beautiful to be around in general. So yeah, be a wetland fan and help other people be that too. Yeah.
Awesome. I've taken up so much of your time, which I'm very good at doing. So, but before we wrap this up, is there like any last things that we didn't talk about that I should have asked that I didn't? Is there like any like last things that you really just wanted to get out there that we just, for some reason, the rest of the conversation didn't come up?
I've done a ton of babbling, and I think your questions have been excellently organized for this. And I really think we covered the ground pretty solidly. But yeah, I certainly would encourage, especially, anyone who's natural history inclined or interested in graduate school and things like that, who wants to do research, like look into this stuff right now. Like we discussed, water is going to be one of the major crises, a number of levels that we are confronting in the near future. And it's going to be one of those hot spots where we need passionate people. We need conservationists. Like, think about water. Like when you're thinking about where to go, what to do, think about water issues as something to research or to learn about or to visit. If you're going to do some conservation travel, like go to some of the world's coolest rivers and help those be protected, and teach people about the species that rely on them. Yeah, that's my big soapbox, I think.
Nice. I love it. I'm all about that travel. So
yeah.
As soon as the Delta variant goes away, let's all just
That's right. Yeah.
Go see the world, even your own backyard, both. Awesome. So how can someone connect with you? If someone wants to chat with you, what's the best way?
A few different ways, I suppose. I'm currently most active on Twitter, although I'm starting to learn my Instagram game a bit. It's taken me a while. I'm slowly getting in there. But on Twitter, I am at Gulo Thoughts, GuloThoughts. Thoughts is a hard word to spell. Glad I got it. A little easier on Instagram, I'm Gulo Shots, GuloShots. I also have a website, vanreesconservation.com, that I have been finally getting that rolling in the last couple of weeks. So that's really going. And of course, people are welcome to contact me through the website. That's very easy. And on social media, I'm very open as well. I'm involved with a podcast called The Nature Guys, which is very fun. A big focus on nature in North America and how to go out and enjoy and learn about nature yourself. Definitely look us up sometime. We do a lot of cool stuff, and we're always looking for more suggestions on material and episodes and stuff. So that's also great. And definitely follow them at nature_guys on Twitter, and Nature Guys Podcast on Instagram. It's a lot of fun. Definitely have a listen.
Yeah. I'm going to be on it here soon, but what? So
yeah, stoked for that.
So we'll definitely do a podcast trade. So everyone will have to listen to that for sure. So it's really good, but awesome. Thank you so much, Charles, for coming on.
Really appreciate it.
So much fun.
Dream come true. I'm a huge fan of the podcast. It's been awesome.
Awesome. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks again for listening to this episode of Rewildology. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe button to never miss a future episode. Do you have a cool environmental organization, travel story, or research that you'd like to share? Let me know at rewildology.com. Until next time, friends, together we will rewild the planet.